Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to pursue a question I asked of the Minister of Environment January 26. It was my first opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to raise with the Minister of Environment and with this House the results of the meetings of the Conference of the Parties of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was COP20 that occurred in Lima, Peru in December. And in the terms of the agreement to which Canada has agreed, countries that are ready to do so, and one would certainly hope that Canada would want to fulfill responsibilities with the rest of the industrialized world, the terms are countries that were ready to do so, would provide their targets and planned actions under a basket of terms now in the UN lingo called INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions, no later than the end of the first quarter of 2015. So that is, of course, next week, March 31st. Canada's statement of intentions are due. Now, if I can back up, Mr. Speaker, in terms of why this is so critical. You'll recall, Mr. Speaker, as well members of this House, that the negotiations that took place in Copenhagen, and what was then the 15th Conference of the Parties, were not successful, but that there was a kind of patched-together side deal called the Copenhagen Accord, which the current Conservative administration greeted favorably. That approach was launched by President Barack Obama as sort of a backroom deal with other nations, in which a two-page agreement was provided to world leaders, such as our Prime Minister, with an approach that was basically fill in the blanks. This country will sign on, and this country will reduce by X amount by X year our greenhouse gas emissions. The goal that was crystal clear and was not fill in the blanks was that the collective level of commitments of the countries that adopted this accord would be sufficient to avoid global average temperatures increasing 2 degrees Celsius more than they were before the Industrial Revolution, and further that the text of the so-called Copenhagen Accord left open the possibility of a much more important target, that we avoid allowing greenhouse gas levels to rise so fast and become so concentrated in the atmosphere that we could actually avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would be a much safer level for a new stabilization in the climate system. Now, Mr. Speaker, leaving Copenhagen, it fell to, once they filled in the blanks, as it were, the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change started crunching the numbers to figure out if every country that took on these commitments met their commitments, is this sufficient to meet the goal of avoiding 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees? They quickly concluded that even if every country that took on a target in Copenhagen back in 2009 met their targets, it would be wholly insufficient to avoid very dangerous levels that soared far above 2 degrees Celsius increase. Now, to avoid that same phenomenon, Mr. Speaker, of commitments being made at the large event only to be totted up later and found insufficient, the parties, which includes the Government of Canada, agreed to this approach to ensure that all of the commitments, including commitments to funding and adaptation and technology transfer, but very specifically reduction of emissions, would be tabled in the first quarter of 2015, so that that addition and that effort to say, if each countries all met their targets, and we now know that Canada has no hope of meeting the targets that we set for ourselves in 2009, but if all the countries gathered in Paris this year meet their targets, is it sufficient? That's why it's critical that Canada get its plans, its intended nationally determined contribution, tabled with the UN Secretariat next week.
Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, this government's record is clear. We have taken decisive action on the environment while protecting our economy. Our government is working to negotiate a new global climate change agreement that includes commitments from all major emitters. We take the challenge of climate change seriously, which is why we are doing our part, reducing emissions in Canada and working with our international partners. À la conférence de Lima,
at the Lima Convention, the parties reiterated their commitment at the international level prior to the holding of the 21st Conference of Paris. The analysis of Canada's contribution after 2020 is currently undertaken, and will take into account the circumstances, economic, geographic, and demographic circumstances of this country. Mr. Speaker, the international efforts of this government on climate change are beyond the negotiations that are taking part under the framework agreement by the United Nations on climate change. We are working in conjunction with other countries through complementary groups such as the Arctic Council, the Montreal Protocol, and the Coalition for Clean Air.
At the end of this year in Paris, Canada will continue to take decisive actions domestically to reduce our emissions while we work with our international partners to confirm a durable global agreement that will put in place a long-term framework for collaborative action. Mr. Speaker, our government will continue to implement its domestic sector-by-sector regulatory approach to achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions while supporting economic growth and job creation opportunities for Canadians. And Mr. Speaker, we know that the NDP and Liberals support a reckless and irresponsible private member's bill that would require Canada to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. Yes, 80%. To achieve this, Mr. Speaker, we would literally have to shut down the entire oil and gas sector, end all electricity generation that produces emissions, and stop all transportation in the country. Mr. Speaker, this is an approach that shows once again how far removed from reality the NDP and the Liberals are. Mr. Speaker, we remain fully committed to the development of an international climate change agreement that is fair, effective, and includes meaningful and transparent commitments from all major emitters.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm profoundly disappointed by my honourable friend, the Parliamentary Secretary. I had expected that the response, knowing the amount of notice that I asked this question January 26th, that the point of these adjournment proceedings is to follow up on questions that are inadequately answered, might at least treat the subject matter of my question. In the last 4 minutes, I'm afraid to say that my friend has ignored the subject matter of my question, which is very specific and very urgent. Is the Government of Canada going to tender the promised intended nationally determined contribution data to the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change when it is due, which is March 31st, that is next week? It's all fine, well and good to hear platitudes about being committed to the convention, but the most important required step by any country really committed to this process is to tender the INDCs on time within the first quarter of 2015. Are we going to do it, Mr. Speaker? Will the Parliamentary Secretary commit now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can be very proud of our record. For example, here in Canada, we have one of the cleanest electricity systems in the world, with 79% of our electricity supply emitting no greenhouse gas emissions. Canada also became the first major coal user to ban the construction of traditional coal-fired electricity generation units. And Mr. Speaker, we will continue to move forward with regulatory measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions while maintaining job creation and economic growth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.